It's always a problem with this course in that one has to study the bits and pieces and then finally put them together. And in studying some of those initial aspects, you're never quite sure really how important they are in the whole scheme of things. So now we begin to see why we've been looking at the central and peripheral chemoreflexes in chemoreceptors in detail, and why we looked at acid-base physiology and the neural connections throughout the brain which will carry these signals. So I'm going to start with an interesting thing that happens quite often in the summer. People set out to swim underwater, and they often have contests with each other. And they've learned that the way to do it is to hyperventilate for 5 minutes. They think they're getting a lot of oxygen on board. What they're doing is getting rid of their CO2, of course. And then you dive in and you swim underwater and you concentrate on going as far as you can. And in many cases, tragedy occurs. Here's a couple of newspaper reports of a 21-year-old man at a public school on Staten Island drowned on Wednesday morning. Same pool, off-duty city lifeguards in critical condition after nearly drowning. You would think he would know, but no, people don't know their respiratory physiology and don't understand, so they need to be educated. And once we're through this, you will know what's happening too. Again, here it happens all over. Senior water polo teams member drowned during team practice. So what we need is a knowledge of the respiratory physiology involved to explain why shallow water blackout and drowning occurs in these cases. And we will find out. This is our respiratory control system hierarchy. We looked at this in the initial lecture. We realized that there are two parts, the parts where we are generating the respiratory rhythm, transmitting it to the spinal respiratory motor neurons, then they operate the respiratory muscles to produce the pulmonary ventilation. There are also upper airway smooth muscles and airway smooth muscle that get a direct input rather than via the spinal cord from the cranial nerve 10. At a local level, there is feedback from muscle receptors back onto the spinal respiratory motor neurons. We won't be going into that, but one should know that it's there. There are airway and lung receptors, we will be going into this, that transmit up via nerve 10, the vagus nerve, back into the respiratory motor neurons, respiratory neurons in the medulla that generate the rhythm and organize it. We have peripheral and central chemoreceptors that are looking at the hydrogen ion concentration. And in the case of the peripheral chemoreceptors, they see the partial pressure of oxygen in the arterial blood going to the brain. The central chemoreceptors, as we saw, simply see the partial pressure of CO2 translated into hydrogen ion concentration. These are the feedback controls that operate into the medullary respiratory neurons via the nucleus tractus solitarius relay stations. Now, what about the respiratory system that we're controlling? It's the CO2 and O2 in the body. What about the storage dynamics of this? How fast do things change if we change the carbon dioxide level or the oxygen level that we are breathing? We have pulmonary ventilation generating the oxygen that goes into the blood, which provides our oxygen stores. And that's virtually it. There's a little bit more stored in myoglobin, but mostly it's in the red cells in the blood. That is being consumed in the tissues. It's a relatively small store. So the changes in the partial pressure of oxygen occur fairly quickly, especially compared with the carbon dioxide stores. Carbon dioxide goes everywhere in the body, driven by the partial pressure gradients, and we see that therefore it is a vast storage space. And we have the metabolic production of carbon dioxide feeding into that store, and we eliminate it via pulmonary ventilation. So in each of these stores, there's a balance between how much is being consumed. Whoops. Let me, somebody let those folks in, please. And balance between the production of carbon dioxide and the pulmonary ventilation elimination. And in the case of oxygen, the pulmonary ventilation supply to the consumption. These balance out, and you can think of the PO2 and the PCO2 as being a measure of the sort of levels. Because the carbon dioxide stores are so large, they change rather slowly. That's an important point to remember. The carbon dioxide stores, and therefore the PCO2 in various tissues, change slowly compared with the oxygen and the partial pressure of PO2. So what about the response timing systems? Yes, I hear a question? No? All right. We have ventilation of the lungs, cardiac output distributing the blood throughout the body, some going to the brain compartment, some going to what we lump as the rest of the tissues compartment. So this is a 3-compartment model here. And we have ventilation of this lung compartment with the outside air. We have an input at the mouth. Suppose we are able to change the partial pressure of CO2 from one breath to the next, which in fact we can using specialized apparatus. And so we have a step change in the partial pressure of CO2 at the mouth. If we looked in the blood leading to the brain at the carotid body level, we would see that it changes fairly quickly. It's not a nice step, but it is pretty fast because it only has a little bit of mixing in the heart and the on the way to the peripheral chemoreceptors. So in about 6 seconds time, the carotid body will see that change, and the peripheral chemoreceptors will respond. Now, what about the brain? Now, the brain is a compartment. It's not as large as the rest of the tissues compartment, but nevertheless, it is a compartment. And the rule for the changes of PCO2 in any compartment type model is that it is the ratio of the volume divided by the flow to that compartment. If you think about that, flow is volume per time. And if we divide the volume of the compartment by flow, volume over time, we get time. And that is the time constant. It's the time for roughly 66%. In other words, in 3 time constants, you virtually reach the final value. So that's why we draw this as an exponential rise here. And as I say, the time constant, roughly 100 seconds for the brain compartment. Now, what about the connections involved and what happens for them? If we take this compartment model and we look at perhaps the neural connections, we have the peripheral chemoreceptors providing a peripheral ventilatory drive to breathe, if you like. And we have the central chemoreceptors providing a central ventilatory drive to breathe. These, as we shall see, add together, and they pass through what we call a drive threshold. What that means is that somewhere between the generation of the respiratory rhythm response down through the spinal motor neurons into the muscles, and finally having the muscles make a change in lung ventilation, somewhere along there, we require that we have a certain drive signal before anything happens to ventilation. And we'll be talking about this later. Once we have the Chemoreflex drive pass through its drive threshold, we have to add on to that something that is completely independent of our respiratory chemoreflex control system, and that is the wakefulness drive. And finally, that produces the ventilation of the lungs. And again, we're going to talk about that as we proceed. So we've said before in this little diagram that ventilation controls gas exchange, which controls the PCO2, which affects the chemoreflexes, which affects ventilation. So we go around in this feedback circle, and we've said that it's a negative feedback because if you increase ventilation, it increases gas exchange, PCO2 will fall, the chemoreflexes will detect that and reduce the ventilation. So in other words, it has a negative effect as we go around the loop. We can take a look at this in more detail here by adding the fact that between the changes in the partial pressure of CO2 and the partial pressure of oxygen, we have the acid-base conversion into the signal that the chemoreflexes see, and that is hydrogen ion concentration. And we add in the fact that in the peripheral chemoreceptors, the partial pressure of O2 modulates the ability of the peripheral chemoreceptors in the carotid body to see the hydrogen ion concentration. In hypoxia, the sensitivity to hydrogen ion concentration is increased. So this part of the system, if you like, in red is the chemoreflexes, and the part in blue here, ventilation controls gas exchange to control the partial pressure of CO2 and O2. We'll talk about that in terms of the metabolic hyperbola later. So how do we measure the respiratory chemoreflexes? How do we know how they work? And I have developed the modified rebreathing method. Rebreathing was first introduced by David Reed, an Australian, quite some time ago in the 60s, and I've modified that in a couple of ways, and these are the ways below. So we want to measure the relations between the chemoreceptor stimulus. We can't really get at the hydrogen ion concentration, but we can get at PCO2, for example, or its surrogate PCO2, and the resulting breathing ventilation in liters per minute. So what's the sensing variable, and what's the output variable ventilation? And what the role of PO2 is. We have to detect that as well. So we use what we call isoxic rebreathing. The PO2 remains constant during the rebreathing. That means we can change that PO2 and see how the responses are at different levels of oxygen. Different in hypoxia than hyperoxia, for example. And we are able, using this, to separate the central and peripheral chemoreflexes, because we can more or less turn off the peripheral chemoreceptors if we make the isoxia hyperoxia. We also introduced the idea of a prior hyperventilation, so that the rebreathing starts at a lower PCO2 than normal. That allows you to detect the chemoreflex threshold as it rises through that threshold. And it also gives you an idea and measurement of what we've called basal ventilation, or the wakefulness drive to breathe, that is independent of the chemoreflexes. So here is the breathing apparatus, and you can do this in various ways. Here is our happy subject here. There's a three-way valve here that we can switch so that they're either breathing room air here or they're breathing out of the bag. And we prime the bag with a certain amount of CO2, as you'll see. But that bag is in a box. We could have used a turbine or any other method of measuring the ventilation. But here we've just put the bag in a box, connected that to a spirometer. That gives us how the lungs are moving, the ventilatory movements, and we can therefore calculate ventilation. Now we have a gas analyzer that is taking a sample at the mouth, and we're measuring the partial pressures of oxygen and carbon dioxide and feeding that information to the computer. The computer is also making a control of oxygen by detecting the actual PO2, and we have told it what PO2 we want for isoxia, and any error causes oxygen to be added to the system, because we take our sample here that's passing through the analyzer and put it back. Otherwise, we would be emptying the volumes out of this system, because once one is connected to the bag and lungs, that is the volume in the system. And we don't want to keep removing volume by our sampling catheter. So how does it work? If this animation is correct, we can give you an idea. Here we are breathing room air. We have a large volume of stored CO2, and it's mostly what we'd call the mixed venous level. The partial pressure of CO2 will tell you what's in the tissues. Metabolism is continuing and adding to this. There is, if you like, a gradient of flow in the partial pressure of CO2 in the arterial blood is lower. And so we are flowing down here, and the alveolar in the lungs, partial pressure of CO2 is roughly the same as the arterial. But we are ventilating the lungs, and so there is the excretion of CO2. We are eliminating it. This is our valve turn to breathe room air situation, and we can switch it into the bag. And what we do is we fill the bag with an amount of CO2 that we have prepared. We know what this should be in advance by our previous experience and calculations. So now we ask the subject to hyperventilate room air. These volumes, as you can see, are fairly small, and so the arterial PCO2 and the PCO2 in the lungs changes fairly quickly, because now we've increased the excretion of CO2. We're still cut off from the bag. Now, this is a large volume, and it takes time to change it. So after 5 minutes, we find that, we've got rid of a fair bit of it, and we are down there. So now what we do is we're going to switch into the bag. And the volume that we have of CO2 in the bag, as you'll see, is just right, because it fills up these rapidly equilibrating arterial and lung levels so that they are about the same as what's in the tissue. And from now on, we are a closed system. The only thing increasing the CO2 is metabolism. And that is a fairly slow process. So for the next 5 minutes of rebreathing, all of these rise together. they rise together because they are mixed by ventilating in and out of the bag and by the circulation of the blood between tissues and lung and the arterial blood. And we will see what this looks like in a real situation here. This is from Dr. Kerr's experiments, where we've seen these before, where he was measuring muscle sympathetic nerve activity as well as ventilation. So here we have the baseline situation. Tidal volume and breathing is here. And we can see that the PO2 is just a little, the end tidal value is a little over 100, and the partial pressure of CO2 is around 40. Now we hyperventilate. The increase in the tidal volume and the frequency of breathing raises the PO2 somewhat, fairly quickly, as you can see. Fairly quickly drops the PCO2 in the lungs, and then there's this long exponential that slowly keeps decreasing over the 5 minutes. And this is, we keep ventilation fairly constant over that time. And now we switch. And what happens? The first breath you get in is quite high, it's from the bag, and then it equilibrates. And you see a flat portion where, although they're breathing in and out of the bag, nothing is happening. So that means we have equilibrated. We're at that point where the mixed venous level of the tissues, the arterial PCO2 and the lung PCO2 are all the same. And from now on, we slowly increase. We keep little injections of PO2 here to keep the end tidal PO2 constant. They, of course, cause a little dip there. But you can see that more or less the CO2 rises continuously during that period of time. And we see the tidal volume here, and more apparently, we see a baseline or wakefulness drive to be ventilation keeps breathing going, even though the CO2 is below the Chemoreflex threshold. And we can identify the threshold at which ventilation begins to increase. We call this the ventilatory recruitment threshold. And then we return to normal. So that is how we can measure the respiratory chemoreflexes. We know what our gradual rise in CO2 is. We know what the ventilation response is, and so we can make a graphical relation of those two variables. The other way of measuring the respiratory chemoreflexes, and this has been a standard method for a while, is if you take somebody who is at rest and then suddenly increase their PCO2 by a given amount and hold it constant, what happens to ventilation? There's that slow rise because it takes time to the body stores of CO2 to change. And so if you want to know what the chemoreflex response is, you have to wait until you've reached an equilibrium. So this is the ventilatory response to this level of PCO2. And you compare that to rebreathing, where we simply do a ramp of CO2 and the ventilation response is here. These are both over time. If we now convert these and put the relations together, ventilation versus the mixed expired PCO2, here is our rebreathing response in this particular subject. We identify the threshold and we see a linear response here. And here is what we get from our steady state experiment. Each point takes us roughly 5 minutes before we've got an equilibrium. So each of these is 5 minutes. This whole thing is measured in 5 minutes. This is 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes worth of a subject's time. You might think that changes might occur during that 20 minutes. But you can see the slope of the line, the sensitivity to CO2 is roughly the same, but they are separated. The same goes for this graph here of subject 5. They are separated, but in this case, the steady state is separated from the rebreathing by a little less of a gap in PCO2. Where does that gap come from? It's because these are measured using the arterial partial pressure of CO2 as measured by end-tidal. But in rebreathing, because we've equilibrated to the mixed venous level or the tissue level before we start to rebreathe, these are relative to mixed venous blood. So the difference here is the arteriovenous difference. It is the arteriovenous shift that we have to make. Rebreathing is relative to venous, steady state is relative to arterial. So we see the arteriovenous difference here. Now, one of the questions that occurs is hypoxia, or if you like, PO2, an independent chemoreflex stimulus to breathing? And we must answer this. In the textbooks that are probably still there, I haven't looked, they always quote Nielsen and Smith experiments from 1952 on about 2 or 3 people. And these are steady state experiments, so each point is a steady state point. And we see the relationship between PCO2 and the ventilation response here in different levels of oxygen. Here, it's both 110 and at 168 partial pressure of PO2. That immediately tells you that the responses are the same, even though you've gone into what you might call hyperoxia. So even at the steady state of 110, you've more or less suppressed the peripheral chemoreceptors. Going to further hyperoxia produces no more suppression, which is why we always think that you can shut down the carotid bodies in hyperoxia. So that's the hyperoxic line, or the normoxic line. If we reduce the PO2 to 47 and then to 37, we see that we change the slope of the line. In other words, as the person gets more hypoxic, they get more and more sensitive to the change in CO2. So down when we're quite hypoxic, as soon as you pass this threshold, the response goes up tremendously. So the other thing apparent in here is that there is indeed a threshold. We saw this with the retrotrapezoid neurons too. They have a threshold. We see this overall in ventilation versus so. This is the ventilatory recruitment threshold. We saw it just a moment ago. What we see here, however, is that as we went from 47 to 37, the ventilation below this ventilatory recruitment threshold increased. So that would say that, hypoxia has an independent stimulus to breathe. So we end up with Nielsen and Smith saying that there is a linear response to CO2 above a threshold. Certainly hypoxia sensitizes the carotid body to CO2, but hypoxia is an independent stimulus. All the experiments I've done show me that that latter conclusion is incorrect. Here are modified rebreathing responses at a fairly low carotid body responder and a very high carotid body responder. You can identify the thresholds immediately. The partial pressures of O2 and tidal are going from 100 down to 40 in each case, 100 down to 40. And we see the sensitization of the responses. And we observe the threshold. What do we observe below the ventilatory recruitment threshold as we go from 100 to 40 in each of these cases? No change in ventilation. This is the wakefulness drive. There is not an independent drive to breathe from hypoxia. Well, are we really satisfied with that? Can we satisfy everybody that reads journals? Let's do another experiment. In this experiment, what we did was we did a rebreathing where we did not hold the oxygen constant. So as you started to breathe in and out of the bag, you produce CO2, so CO2 rises slowly. You use up oxygen, and oxygen falls much quicker. And so here is the ventilation response to end-tidal PCO2. When we do that, we can identify a ventilatory recruitment threshold, and there is the CO2 level below that. And what is happening is the ventilation here. If we now plot this section, ventilation versus the end-tidal PO2, in this case, below the ventilatory recruitment threshold, as the end-tidal PO2 gets extremely low, nothing happens. And this is one subject, subject 2. If you do 9 of them and do average binned responses, 65 to 70 PO2, all the way down to 35 to 40, and bin the responses, there is no change in ventilation as you get hypoxia. So there is no independent stimulus from PO2. All it does, as we saw in our peripheral chemoreceptor topic, it just changes the sensitivity to CO2. Now, we talked earlier about, been talking about the chemoreflexes. What about how ventilation controls the PCO2 and the PO2? And we referred to that as the metabolic hyperbola. Why did we call it a hyperbola? Well, if you look at the CO2 elimination, it varies as the alveolar ventilation of the lungs times what's actually in the lungs in terms of the partial pressure of CO2. And so we can turn that equation around and solve for alveolar ventilation and say, alveolar ventilation varies as the CO2 elimination divided by the alveolar PCO2. This is an equation, and this CO2 elimination, as long as we keep ventilation constant at any particular value, then we have y is equal to a constant divided by x. That is the equation of a rectangular hyperbola. And indeed, here it is. Ventilation, arterial PCO2. As you breathe harder and harder, ventilation going up, the PCO2 goes down. But it doesn't go down in a linear fashion, it goes down in this rectangular hyperbolic fashion. So, what does that mean for us? It means that up here around our resting value of 40 PCO2, the slope here is fairly shallow. Ventilation is quite effective. If I change my ventilation just very slightly, I will lose 10 millimeters of mercury PCO2. Ventilation is effective, very effective at the higher PCO2. However, if I've already hyperventilated down to 20 and I want to go down to 10, I have to go an awful long way in ventilation to get down there. Ventilation is much less effective at lower PCO2. So that is an interesting thing to keep in mind. Now let's look at our graphical model of how the respiratory chemoreflex control system works. We can characterize, if you like, the central chemoreceptors, the retrotrapezoid nucleus, and its input is central hydrogen ion concentration, and the output is a central drive to breathe. From our rebreathing experiments, we know that the central chemoreceptor threshold is roughly down at this point, and it's a linear response. Nice and simple, the central chemoreceptor response, a linear response with a threshold. Now, what about producing ventilation? Well, here's the central drive to breathe. Here's the central chemoreceptor threshold. This is our linear response. It has to get to a drive threshold before we see any changes of ventilation in the lungs. We talked about this. Somewhere in the signal pathway from the central chemoreceptors down through the medulla to the spinal cord, out to the muscles, and how they control the movement of the lungs. Somewhere in there, there is a threshold which must be passed. We must have to have enough of a drive in order to get things to move. And this is the drive threshold. And these two thresholds, the central chemoreceptor threshold and the drive threshold, determine the PCO2 at which ventilation increases, what we know as the ventilatory recruitment threshold, or VRT. So there is the central chemoreflex response in detail. What about some of the aspects of the central chemoreflex? And some of these we've talked about before. There is the blood-brain barrier for polar solutes, so that brain tissue and central chemoreceptors may have a different hydrogen ion concentration than seen in arterial blood, especially during acid-base disturbances. Keep that in mind. The central chemoreceptors are located in brain tissue. They're in the medulla. They are in a tissue compartment. Consequently, as we talked earlier, central chemoreceptors respond slowly to the increases in inspired CO2. There's a transport delay of roughly 10 seconds to reach the brain. Then there's an exponential rise with a time constant of 100 seconds. Think about this in relationship to the shallow water blackout problem. Now here are the peripheral chemoreceptors. These are more complex, and they give us more of a difficulty in understanding and modeling them. There is the peripheral chemoreflex threshold in terms of arterial hydrogen ion concentration in this case, and this is the peripheral drive to breathe in liters per minute. And we know that the PO2 modulates the sensitivity or the slope of these linear responses. So we've got a linear response with a threshold and a slope, or you might call it sensitivity, which depends on the PO2, and it's a non-linear dependence. It makes it even more complicated to model. So we go, as we did for the central chemoreceptor, and say, okay, the peripheral chemoreflex drive to breathe must pass this drive threshold. And so if we had just the peripheral alone without the central, as we saw before, the central without the peripheral, then we see our fan of lines here. As hypoxia increases, the sensitivity goes up. And depending on where the peripheral chemoreceptor threshold is, depending upon what the drive threshold is, depending on what the PO2 threshold is, we get a ventilatory recruitment threshold. So that's how they're determined. Now, what about the sensitivity? The sensitivity to PCO2 or hydrogen ion concentration, we just use PCO2 because that's all we can really measure. What about that sensitivity versus PO2? Yes, we know as we get hypoxic, the sensitivity increases, but is it linear? No, it's not. It's a rectangular hyperbolic relationship again. Similar kind of curve as we saw for the metabolic hyperbola. It seems to be asymptotic to a zero sensitivity, as we even saw in the Nielsen and Smith experiments. When they went really, really hyperoxic, changed it from roughly 110 to 200, nothing much changed in the slope. Indeed, we think that is the case. You silence the ability to respond to CO2 of the carotid body in hyperoxia. Some people say that there is a sort of tonic drive out of the peripheral chemoreceptors. I'm not so sure. This part of the rectangular hyperbola is asymptotic to this line roughly at 30. Why would that be? Why wouldn't it be asymptotic to 0? Well, if you think about it, we are getting more and more hypoxic. We are unable to supply the oxygen we need for keeping our regulators of hydrogen ion concentration in the intercellular chemoreceptor cells. We are unable to regulate that, so we're going to run out of the point where the oxygen supply is not enough and we shut down. And that would occur very close to 0. And so we think that roughly the gradient between arterial blood and the tissue where the measurements are going is roughly 30 millimeters of mercury. So by the time we would get down to 30 millimeters of mercury, we are virtually anoxic with no oxygen present, and we've stopped any activity. So as we looked at for the central chemoreflex, what about the peripheral chemoreflex? It responds to PCO2 with the sensitivity controlled by PO2. Consequently, when the PO2 is high, hyperoxia, the peripheral chemoreceptors do not respond to PCO2. So if you had a central depression of the central chemoreceptors, so they were not there, perhaps in a case of an overdose, either alcohol, opioid, any central depression, and you don't have central chemoreceptors, the only thing you have keeping you breathing are your peripheral chemoreceptors. Now, what happens if you come into the hospital and they give you oxygen to breathe? There's a threshold for the PCO2 response of the peripheral chemoreceptors as well. And when with PCO2 is below threshold, and we call this hypocapnic, say, the peripheral chemoreceptors do not respond to hypoxia. This is the relationship we should think about in the case of shallow water blackout. Now, do the central and peripheral drives interact? We saw some ideas of that from the animal experiments looking at the retrotrapezoid nucleus by Patrice Guéné's laboratory, and what they said about it. They seemed to be independent as far as they were concerned. However, my good friend Jerry Dempsey in his laboratory, they do dog experiments, and what they observe is that the gain or the sensitivity of the central or CNS, central nervous system, CO2 chemoreceptors in dogs is critically dependent upon the carotid body afferent activity. And so that the central peripheral interaction results in a hyperadditive ventilatory response to central hypercapnia. And they published this, and they keep on claiming that this is the same in humans. The human experiments, even before I tried to do this, showed that no, it's additive. And we did human experiments, and this is what we published. The responses to isocapnic hypoxia at high and low central PCO2 are not different. That confirms the conclusion of previous studies that central and peripheral chemoreflex signals interact additively. And we pointed out that this contrasts with the findings from recent animal experiments, and therefore you need caution when using animal experiments to make conclusions about the physiology of the respiratory chemoreflexes in humans. So that's one thing. The carotid bodies may be different. One of the other things that we think about when we look at breathing and the control of the tidal volume is we remember the so-called Herringbroia reflex, where as the lung volume gets bigger, you begin to stop the breathing at a particular volume, so that our Herringbroia reflex controls our volume. And the reason for thinking that comes from dog experiments, whereby if you cut the vagus nerve in dogs, then the breathing becomes very slow, frequency of breathing, slow breaths per minute, and high tidal volumes. This does not happen in humans. What about the central peripheral chemoreceptor interaction? Well, as we saw, it caused controversy. There was a crosstalk in the Journal of Physiology. We defended, Jason Matika, my former student, and I defended the additive effects point of view. Luc Teffema from the Netherlands, crosstalk opposing view. So there we are. And the rebuttals back and forth, the comments from everybody. I think it's very simple to determine what's happening, whether we've got additive. Oh, and by the way, I should mention that in rats, it is hypoadditive. In dogs, it's hyperadditive. In humans, it's additive, as shown by a rebreathing experiment. What do you observe? What did we just show you? We showed you ventilation versus PCO2 as a linear response. If it was hyperadditive, then as you decrease the PO2, what would happen? Would we get a linear response? No, we'd get a hyperadditive response like that, or a hypoadditive response, so that as the PCO2 is increasing in the carotid body, it would add more and more to the central to get this and bend the line upward. Hypoadditive would bend it downwards. So the last aspect we have to deal with is the basal ventilation, or if you like, we call it the wakefulness drive, because it disappears during sleep. And we have our gas exchange here and our chemoreflexes here in our feedback model, and we're plotting ventilation versus arterial PCO2. And we have the Chemoreflex drive. And we add to that the resting metabolic hyperbola in this graph, and we have to add in now a wakefulness drive to the chemoreflex drive, and when we do so, we see there's the complete response. There's our wakefulness drive or subthreshold or basal ventilation drive before we reach the ventilatory recruitment threshold, and then our chemoreflex response. And there, the intersection is where we solve the two equations in two unknowns, and we reach an equilibrium point. So we've done it graphically here. We have an equation for the rectangular resting metabolic hyperbola. We have a linear equation for the chemoreflexes. You could do this algebraically, but it's very easy to show graphically here as the intersection. This is where we come to rest, at a resting PCO2 of 40 and a ventilation of somewhere around 10 liters per minute. So let us now add the central and the peripheral chemoreflex responses. This is central plus peripheral drives to ventilation now. Now we have to be careful because we're plotting this versus arterial, not tissue. And we measured the chemoreflexes when we were measuring the central chemoreceptors at its tissue value. The arterial chemoreceptors, the carotid body, would have seen the its arterial value. That didn't change. But now we have to account for the fact that the central chemoreceptor threshold is shifted down from where the peripheral chemoreflex threshold is, because the central chemoreceptors are at a PCO2 or hydrogen ion concentration that is, they are at a higher than what we measure in the arterial. So when we reach an arterial of 30, the central are actually, sorry, when we reach an arterial of 35, no, I've got this the wrong way around. Tricky. Let me think this through again. So as we rise through a CO2 of arterial 35, the central are actually at 30. So we have to put it in there. And here's our central in our hyperoxia. And if you're hyperoxic at 150, you have shut down the carotid body. Now we have to add in the carotid body, whose threshold is now at a higher level compared with the central. And that's due to this difference, the arterial to central or arteriovenous difference. And we can now add in these, and we get our fan of lines here. And we can see that we've got a chemoreflex drive threshold involved, so that these drives don't affect ventilation until they pass this threshold. And now we can identify the ventilatory recruitment thresholds if we're just summing the two chemoreflexes, central and peripheral. But of course, we have to consider the wakefulness drive. So we have to add that to these chemoreflex responses. And then when we plot the rectangular metabolic hyperbola, we find the intersection, the equilibrium point. This is where we come to rest. So at a PO2 of 150, we intersect the metabolic hyperbola a little over 40, ventilation around 10. And as we can see, as the PO2 goes lower and lower from 150 to 50 to 35, that equilibrium point changes. You'll notice the ventilatory response isn't much because the metabolic hyperbola is so shallow. So how can you tell that there is a hypoxic depression of ventilation here? Then you've involved the carotid body. By measuring ventilation, you really can't tell. Here I am at 150. And here I am at 35 in ventilation. If I look at that, well, the subject is not breathing much. But if you examine the PCO2, you'll notice that has changed quite a bit. So that's why we look at patient PCO2 rather than ventilation to detect when we are getting a depression of the chemoreflexes in hypoxia. What happens if we go to sleep? Well, the wakefulness drive here has disappeared because we're asleep. And so now we have apnea thresholds, where if we go below this threshold, we don't breathe. And the equilibrium points now, if you compare them, are moved. Here we are at 45, and here we were only at 41 or 2. So when we go to sleep, our CO2 increases, and our ventilation hardly changes at all, because we're on the flat portion of the metabolic hyperbola. So here's our apnea thresholds. And so if I am sleeping up at altitude, my carotid bodies are quite sensitive, I'm quite sensitive. It doesn't take much ventilation change for me to move to here, and the CO2 goes below threshold. And when that happens, we stop breathing. And so we'll find that when we examine breathing at altitude, that we have an oscillation possible, where we might stop breathing and then start and stop and start and go back and forth. Now, I put this up to remind me that I can show you this model put together as a graphical model. But I think we'll do that later, because then I'll involve going out of PowerPoint and into LabVIEW and back. So that's just to remind me to show you that we can get a graphical model. We can put the rebreathing results in terms of the sensitivity in a PO2 of 150, the sensitivity at a PO2 of 50, that we've measured in our rebreathing, and also the ventilatory recruitment threshold in the hyperoxic versus hypoxic. We can put in what we think the cardiac output is in the cerebral blood flow, 20% of that, and the CO2 production, and how much CO2 production might be in the brain, 20% of the normal. We can put in the wakefulness drive, and we can decide what their arterial PO2 and the inspired PCO2. And it makes a nice model, and you can see where you come in your equilibrium. So we'll do that afterwards. So one of the things we asked previously in the talk is, does brain blood flow affect the chemoreflex control system? We looked at the retrotrapezoid nucleus experiments where it didn't seem to, and I think I showed you this before. We have a couple of people saying the idea that a CO2-induced vasodilation would accelerate the removal of CO2 that counteracts the drive to breathe in the central chemoreceptors. And so I showed you what might happen in our modeling results after a hyperventilation. What does the recovery look like? This is when we have a cerebral blood flow response to CO2, and this is when we don't, and which one is observed. Sorry, this is oh yes, it's the other way around. I put it correctly here. And so which do we observe? And we'll find out perhaps. We return to the question that we started with, and that was the shallow water blackout. Apart from the wakefulness and the exercise to breathe, there's no chemoreflex drive to breathe until the ventilatory recruitment threshold is exceeded. Now you are breathing, you're trying to breathe underwater from your exercise drive and your wakefulness drive perhaps, but you're suppressing that. And you haven't got any chemoreflex drives to overcome until you get past this threshold. So PCO2 is rising slowly. You're moving towards this, but the PO2 is decreasing much quicker. You're getting very, very sensitive in the carotid body, so that if you pass this threshold, boy, you'd have a drive to breathe that would force you to come to the surface very quickly. But if the PO2 falls too far before you reach this threshold, then you become unconscious underwater.